Okay, hello everybody. My name is Alejandro Guille, and I have the pleasure of serving as Bloomington Symphony Orchestra's artistic director and conductor, and we're so happy that you're here joining us tonight via Zoom and via Facebook. And even if you're not catching it live, that you're still getting to see it a little bit later before the concert on this Sunday, October 24th at 5 p.m. at the Buskirk Chumley Theater. We are so happy to welcome here tenor, scholar, and cultural activist and pedagogue Dr. Marquese Carter, who has distinguished themselves as a force of change in the world of classical music. Their work, whether in written scholarship or in the performing arts, has centered on composers from marginalized populations. Dr. Carter's work as an American teaching artist seeks to decolonize the lens through which music is understood and appreciated in contemporary culture. Their research on the art songs of Florence Price has been featured in numerous forums, including the Society for American Music Conference and the New York Times, among others. Their dissertation is titled The Poet and Her Songs, Analyzing the Art Songs of Florence Beatrice Price. Dr. Carter serves also as president of the International Florence Prize Festival, where they curated and administered the first virtual Florence Prize Festival in 2020. And I know that there's already been a successful 2021 edition. You might have heard them recently in a virtual concert with the Bloomington-based Amity Trio, where they premiered A Lullaby for a Black Mother by Florence Price. Dr. Carter joined the music faculty of Murray State University in 2020, where they teach voice and music history. And in their free time, Dr. Carter enjoys knitting, reading poetry, practicing yoga, concocting home remedies, and singing along to gospel music tracks in their front room. We're definitely going to follow up on that last bit. And so without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Marquese Carter. Hello.
Hello, thank you for having me. It's so great to see all these familiar faces from Bloomington. It's like a flash from the past. I love it.
And we can't wait to welcome you back in person. So thank you very much again. I just wanted to open our discussion today very informally, but just do you mind just sharing with us a little bit about your one of your earliest musical memories?
Oh my word. My earliest musical memory was perhaps performing in my living room. I was raised by my grandparents who were both working class. My grandmother was a nurse at the Veterans Affairs in town. My grandfather was a custodian. And I remember very fondly on weekends when both parents were home, we would just sit in the front room. And I remember very fondly learning that I could pick up tunes pretty well. And so my grandparents would listen to Luther Vandross records. And one of the earliest songs I remember is "A Chair is Still a Chair, even when there's no one sitting there." And I learned how to do all of that as like 8 years old, and I learned every little cadence of Luther's voice. And I just remember singing in that front room, and my grandmother would cry and my grandpa would cry, that way that you don't really see, in that generation of my grandparents and masculine presenting folks crying like that. And I just remember thinking, wow, if I can have that much effect on people with my voice, that's kind of cool. And that's what kind of got me into singing, as opposed to I'd played trombone too, but that's a whole nother story. I ended up doing singing instead.
So that's wonderful. What a wonderful connection. I have some similar stories of my own, maybe not with Luther Vandross, but similar situations in which we have just get captivated at a really young age, and we can't wait to be the ones that are trying to cause that effect on people. Do you mind just going into a little bit more depth about when you decide to go into singing and how that whole process happen in terms of your education and I'm thinking like way before college and all of that, like who begins to nurture that talent and just anything along those lines that you want to share with us.
Oh, sure. I'm really indebted to the church I grew up in. I actually grew up Seventh-day Adventist, which I no longer practice now, but I carry a lot of those hymns, the way in which my uncle used to lead the gospel choir, and we would sing the parts. My uncle would come up with a tune, and They'd say, he'd say, Mark, go on and sing this. You sing soprano on this, and you sing alto on this, and let's just find the 3-part harmony. And that's how I grew up making music. We would just figure out and hear harmony. And that kind of started my ear training journey, although it's in that sort of oral tradition akin to the Black church that doesn't require you have to read music for you to understand how music communicates. And so I started out with that interest. And then of course I came to middle school and high school. It's time to choose an instrument. I really wanted to play violin or viola, or no, violet cello. I was obsessed with the cello. I think I
Yeah.
saw that movie Music of the Heart.
Yes, Meryl Streep. Yeah.
Meryl Streep. And I just,
Gloria Stefan. Yeah.
yes, exactly. I was enamored by the sound of the cello. I said, I want to play that. And my grandpa said, honey, we can't afford a cello. You got to play something cheaper. So, so I ended up playing a trombone. That was a lot cheaper. And I continued to sing in my church choir. And then something really interesting happened. I got through middle school and I continued to sing. I would do little talent shows here and there. I would sing with my church choir. But I ended up moving to Louisville, Kentucky to live with my mother. And when I moved there, it's sort of like my world opened up and I moved to a bigger city. I grew up in a very small town, Marion, Indiana. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with Marion, Indiana. But
I bet, yeah.
I'm sure, yeah. Grew up on the Mississinawa River, and what people did for fun there was hang out in the Walmart parking lot. So that was my frame of reference for a fun evening. Then I moved to Louisville, and there was just this confluence of culture. I met other Black people. I met other Black queer people who I'd never been around. I discovered parts of myself that I didn't know were there. And my mind just kind of opened up to the world of what it could be. And then unfortunately, I experienced some hardships there. Me and my family experienced some housing insecurity, and I lost my trombone. It was thrown out by somebody we stayed with. So my trombone was thrown in a dumpster along with a good portion of my clothing. And so here I was with sort of 3 pairs of clothes I could change into. I was going to my school and family was struggling. And the thing that kept me going through it was just continuing to sing, writing music. I had a friend at my church at the time. We would sit down and just write songs together. And then she ended up being the person who acted like a sort of surrogate mother while my mom was getting things back together. And I just surrendered to singing. It's like the universe just plucked that trombone out of my hand. And in retrospect, my heart was kind of broken because I loved being a trombonist. And I thought I wasn't good enough to be a singer. I thought I can be the best trombonist. But I said, no, I'm not one of those singers. I'm not Whitney Houston. And that was my, that was like my message.
Who else is Whitney Houston besides Whitney Houston?
Right. But as a child, you think, oh, well, that's all. If I'm not that, why bother? That was sort of my mindset. And just turned out that I met the right teacher in high school. They said, you could do a degree in music. And I said, that's a thing. Oh, I could do a degree in voice. And they're like, So they taught me a few little songs so I could audition for University of Louisville. To this day, I sang Après un rêve, which is a beautiful French song by Fauré. Don't know if that was actually French I sang, but apparently it was good enough to get my teacher, Daniel Weeks. Hope he sees this. He's a great, great, sweet teacher who took a chance on somebody who barely read music and didn't know their languages and really didn't know what I was getting into. But I just loved singing. And I was endlessly curious about it. I wanted to learn the languages. I wanted to learn the cultures that these opera arias, these songs came from. And at that point, in retrospect, I thought, oh, I must be the first Black person doing this. I want to do that. Didn't know about Leontine Price or Jessie Dorr or any of those. I was like, I must be the only person who does this because my mama doesn't know anything about opera. So it's not for us. I must be the first one. So it was a moment of, this is for me. And I'm going to, even though I don't know what the heck I'm doing, I know I love it. So I'm going to keep trying. And that's sort of been, that's what started the process. And then I ended up moving on to do my master's and then did my doctorate at Indiana University and found my love of voice teaching. And thanks to some mentors, chief among them, Alicia Lola Jones at Indiana University, helped me find my voice as a musicologist as well,
Mm-hmm.
Ayanna Smith as well. And I
Mm-hmm.
started to find this sort of identity of this intersecting identity as a performer and an artist, a creative, and someone who's interested in fighting for equity and change in the arts. And so that's it's a winding road. I tell my students I would have never planned. There's no degree that says, you know, start a nonprofit and sing and do lectures.
Yeah, there's definitely no formula. I can definitely relate, in the world of conducting, uh, realizing that there's no formula and that you have to make your own way, and that, at least in my case, as long as I continue to work with great people who are willing to take risks, and we're willing to build community, I think that's the most important thing.
Mhm.
That previous answer, I mean, there's so much to unpack there, and I think we all appreciate how open and candid you're being, and it's wonderful to get to see your journey. I wonder if we can expand a little bit on two things, but let's do one at a time. Just at what moment does does the person of Florence Price enter your life? How does that happen? And tell us a little more about that.
Sure. I discovered Florence Price I was at IU looking for a dissertation topic. I knew I wanted to write about an African American composer, and I knew I wanted to write about an African American woman composer because I never performed any music by a Black woman. And I knew it was out there. I kind of heard in passing some different pieces. I heard some Margaret Bonds, but I just wondered, at first I thought I might do Undine Smith Moore or Dorothy Rudd Moore, and I had a trouble finding enough sources on them in the library. And I had a light bulb moment. In my master's at Westminster Choir College, when I first dipped my toe in musicology, I did a paper on George Whitfield Chadwick, who was sort of an early American composer, Boston School, and actually was Florence Price's organ teacher and composition teacher. And so I had heard her name through researching Chadwick, and I realized, I wonder if there's more on this Price character. And I began to go down the rabbit hole and listen to the beautiful songs and find multiple, what I would consider masterpiece art songs. And I said, this is it. And really, the thing that caught on was just how she had been rediscovered. And it was really poignant to me how a composer who had such a consistent and steady output was silenced by the systemic oppression that would overlook a Black woman's contributions. And I started to question, are there others today who we're overlooking? Is Price just a prototype for what we keep repeating today? And so I became really fascinated with her story, her influences, her aesthetic. And I became enthralled with trying to ask the question, how do we look at the art songs of Black women composers without centering a European lens? And what that means for me is oftentimes it's a comparative analysis. Price sounds like something else, and we'll pick Schubert, Brahms, dot, dot, dot. William Grant still reminds us of Brahms' Symphony something, something. And it's never really assessed on the aesthetic values of the Black community or of a sort of Afro-logical point of view that centers things like improvisation, oral tradition, signifying gestures, the way in which Black composers communicate hidden messages in music. So I just said, what happens if I do away with all the things I've been taught in terms of how to analyze art song, and I just analyze it from philosophies and aesthetics that come from that community? And wow, was that a revelation, because I found so much rich discourse and so much rich communication that I would have missed if I was trying to situate Price in a European lineage. So it was, yeah, that's how I found my way to it. I don't seem to know how to answer questions shortly, but that's
Oh,
that's how I found my way there.
that's no, that's so wonderful, and of course I'm hearing you speak, and I'm thinking about my own struggles. I just figured that today we would sort of back and forth, bounce back and forth between your experiences and mine, kind of as a way to share our how we've both come to learn about this composer that is bringing us together in completely different ways, and completely agree that one of my struggles has also been like, okay, oh, this sounds like, oh, this sounds like, oh, this, and then hold on a second, saying, and then kind of concluding. I was even having a conversation with my wife in the car as early as last night after rehearsal. It's like the more we get into her music, at least her fourth symphony, which is what we're doing this Sunday, we say she sounds like Florence Price, you know? And especially the more music of hers that I get into via some of her solo piano works and her other symphonies, her violin concerto, some of all these other pieces that were also rediscovered in the 2000s. You can relate it maybe to other pieces of hers. You can sort of begin to hear, oh, this is her musical language, but it is very much her, and that's a wonderful thing that you can judge something on its own merit and on its own value without falling into comparisons. So that's so wonderful. I wonder if you could go a little bit more in detail without necessarily giving it away, because we want people to come see you in live and also in person on Sunday. But maybe just give a little bit of an anticipation of what they can look forward to in terms of the specific songs you have chosen, art songs you have chosen to perform, and perhaps how you're gonna draw some of these connections that you've been sort of inferring.
Sure. I thought it would be interesting um, to share about Price in a way that didn't just have to be me talking at you, but rather in a way that we can hear her language develop. One of the things I love about her art songs is their lovely snapshots of her various approaches. And I borrow some of that language from Raylinda Brown, who unfortunately passed away not very long ago, but was one of the preeminent Price scholars and was one person who encouraged me on my path before even meeting me. She just read an email from a doctoral student and said, "You sound like you have a lot going for you in this project. Keep doing it."
Hmm.
Basically, you have my blessing. Keep going. And I needed that because I said, "Am I doing this right?" She's like, "Yes, just keep going."
Hmm.
Um, those pieces I've chosen highlight different challenges that Price faced, both systemically and personally. Particularly, I do begin with actually a song that's not Price. It's The Negro Speaks of Rivers, a piece by one of her students, Margaret Bonds. And this is pretty intentional because this piece not only speaks to historicity and the way that Black composers are retelling past stories and reinterpreting them in the present, borrowing idioms from West Africa and from our roots in the transatlantic slave trade and translating them into a modernistic aesthetic. And that piece talks about this concept of Sankofa. This is a Akan symbol from West Africa, from the Akan people. And this
Hmm.
is a symbol that represents, it literally means reach back and get it. It's
Hmm.
this idea that only through reflection on our roots and our history can Black folks progress and define our future. So I choose that piece on purpose because it's a philosophically grounding piece. And then other pieces I've chosen highlight Price's both Afro-romantic aesthetic, her aesthetic that kind of reveals a late romantic approach to harmony that involves and enfolds blues aesthetics, jazz aesthetics, and pentatonicism, the types of kind of musical language that we hear recurring over and over again, sort of shared language. I also choose pieces that show her experimental side. Um, for example, I choose a newer piece that no one has hopefully heard before, otherwise I'm lying, Bright Be the Place, a new work that I found in the archives at University of Arkansas. This is a Lord Byron setting
Hmm.
uh, of the great sonnet and love poem writer Lord Byron. And Price here is melding together. You hear her in her full maturity as a composer, playing with dissonance, playing with enfolding, that's a word again I'm coming to, sort of a jazz aesthetic with an impressionistic aesthetic with her own tonal world. So, I identify some common threads that you can hear in her music, but on the other level, I love talking on multiple levels. It's my nerdy place. There's also these themes of masking gestures, how she as a Black woman had to move through these classical art spaces and defend her right to be there, her choices to foreground certain forms, her foregrounding of sonata principle and the way in which she uses sonata allegro form in a song form to say, hey, I have this background and I can do that too, but let me show you how I can reinvent it. Um, Yeah, there's so much. I also talk about how do we view Price as a feminist, or a womanist is a more appropriate term. How do we see her in the wake of emergent resistance movements in Chicago led by Black women? And that's most embodied by The Washerwoman, where Price encounters and talks about um, the problem of domestic labor and how women, Black and otherwise, were stuck in this cycle of trying to work in other people's houses, and trying to build economic independence, and how it just keeps incurring more cost as another form of economic slavery. And so Price's ability through music to address so many contemporary issues is what led me to choose these different pieces that not only introduce you to Price's varied musical language. I think we underestimate songs. This is kind of the thing. In the academy, we tend to underestimate songs as sort of frilly froth, not having depth, um, can't really communicate a lot to us. A full symphony can tell us everything composers are able to do, but a song can't do that. And I
Mm,
beg to differ with Price. Price's songs are miniature symphonies for the voice. And you
mhm.
can hear it in the way in which she encounters topics, themes, and transforms them. And every measure of these art songs is latent with detail, narrative, and multi-layered communication. So that's what my hope is, that you can hear how Price communicates autobiographically, collectively, and musically through these songs.
I think we're all so excited and in awe already of some of the things you're sharing, and I hope all of you listening tonight on Zoom or on Facebook or watching even this later will just be even more excited than you thought you were about this concert. You know, I'm particularly looking forward to the aspect of the art songs myself because I love to sing also, and I understand the depths that song cycles that have sort of pervaded my childhood. And of course, you go to the usual people like Schubert, Schumann, you know, but then also some amazing composers from my homeland. I thought it was really interesting to take the risk to put art songs in a traditionally symphonic program, and to show the audience that we could highlight some of her compositional voice in different ways. So I'm so glad that this is how we're doing it. And I'm confident that after you have done that and share that with the audience, by the time the symphony comes along, there will be such a better understanding than if I were to stand there and even, say all these things about the symphony itself. So that's really so exciting. I wonder if we could go into a place that you alluded to earlier, specifically talking in terms of equity in the arts. And I want to just kind of throw it at you in an open-ended fashion to see if you can just comment about some of the existing and lingering challenges, and some of the things that I think we can all do from our different perspectives, our different stands, to be able to make a difference. And this concert maybe is an example of doing something in that direction. But I wonder if you could just speak in general, however the mind moves you in terms of this very important issue of equity in the arts.
Yeah, that's the hardest question you've asked. So yeah,
I
don't let
know. We were warming up, but I think it's important to at least attempt to tackle it a little bit, and it's
oh,
it's
no,
important.
no, it is. There's so many ways I like to think about this. The one that's resonant right now is actually my typical yogic answer as a yoga teacher. Stick with me for a second; it'll make sense.
Okay.
Um, there's this concept in yogic philosophy, Vedic philosophy, is svadhyaya, which is self-knowledge or self-study. And it is apparent to me after working being on a lot of panels like this, and working in a university, being on committees. Anyone who's worked in the university knows about the endless committees that we committee to committee and meet to meet, and it's lovely. And we make progress, but very slowly. And I'm impatient. But the thing that comes, the thing that comes up for me is the importance of self-study. It is very vital that before people engage in work that is trying to center Black composers, that is indeed being labeled as decolonized. And really, when we say that, we're saying we are looking back at the process of colonization, these mechanisms that tell us that the Black experience is so averse is so antithetical to humanity that we would marginalize it and leave it to the shadows, and that we would civilize it by centering these other composers, that we would center a white patriarchal lens of what a concert hall looks like in hopes that somehow it civilizes our society. That is what we're talking, this is what we're against, that is what the process is. We must start that work internally. We must first look at ourselves in the mirror and acknowledge where our biases lie. For example, I've learned that even though I have multiple intersecting identities, one thing that I've had to start to engage in as a teacher is learning how to be more embracing of neurodiversity in my pedagogy, looking at the way in which I present information, the modules that I put on Canvas, whether they are legible or work for a screen reader system, learning how to think outside of my box of my privilege of ability. I think it's vital that before we make changes to large systems, that we start at home and that we look at what can change in our own backyard in terms, or in our own front door, in terms of where our points of privilege and power lie and where we can leverage that to help someone else who might be a few steps behind us. Then and only then can we begin to look at the musical choices we make in terms of programming, in terms of what we teach our students, in terms of what we advocate for at PTA meetings and PTO meetings, in terms of whose needs we center at board meetings, at community engagement meetings. It looks like mobilizing what power you have, whether it be in your job, in your concert hall, using that power to create space for someone who may not have a voice. Because there is wisdom in listening to the marginalized. There's an wisdom in what Lama Rod Owens calls indigeneity. The indigeneity, those who are connected to the land, those who were here first, those who from whom we've stolen space. There's a wisdom there that's just waiting for us to benefit. And that wisdom will benefit us musically, culturally. It'll benefit the world in terms of climate change. It'll benefit in so many ways if we engage first in self-study and then create ways to listen to folks who are not used to listening to, whether that be in your concert hall or in your studio or what have you. It starts there. That sounds like a very broad and philosophical answer, but there's a lot of specifics that can come off of that. But I believe that firmly. If you don't study yourself, how can you fix anything? If you don't know who you are, how can you ethically engage and change? So that's an important place to start.
Yeah, thank you for that very candid answer. I would just follow up by saying that, of course, we're being challenged in many different ways as a society, and particularly in the arts, in symphonic music, specifically in terms of what led BSO to program this. We were trying as early as late 2018. And again, it was on the merits of discovering a specific person who had been, in some ways unearthed through all these sort of treasure trove that was found in that abandoned attic, but always trying to center on the music itself. And then, of course, then all the events of 2020 that happened, not just the pandemic, but we're talking about all the things, with George Floyd, et cetera, and all the movement of Black Lives Matter, et cetera. But that it can be easy to focus on this one thing as a catalyst for a lot of other things to happen, and it maybe leaves less room for having this kind of greater discussion that you're inviting us to do. And I think it's also important to remind ourselves that these issues of equity and inclusion, diversity, and everything are so multifaceted. I mean, you just brought up the connection to neural ability, and how you have to cater your materials for people who are engaging with information in a different way. I think just continuing to being open minded and being willing to accept that there's a lot to learn and to change in that regard, I think is also a great first step. And that I also believe firmly that there's so much more that unites us than divides us, and that music continues to be that great catalyst, that great unifier, that great universal language through which different people can approach the music without needing to know anything else. We could have people in our audience on Sunday that don't know anything about Florence Price other that they can read that, you know,
Mhm.
it sounds like it may be a this might be a woman, and stop there, listen to the music and let that speak to them in whatever way, and that is also important. Of course, it's important to try to understand how a person was led to create music and everything, but also let that thing first wash over you, and then do more research.
Mhm.
I wonder if as a kind of, I mean, sounds like we don't have a shortage of things to talk about, so that's great. But as a kind of shifting a little bit, um, when you talk about some of the interests that you have outside of music, and I know I alluded to a little bit at the beginning, and it's I think very refreshing that your bio begins finishes like that. But I wonder if you could just share more with our audience here about all the things that make you tick, because you know, as musicians, as much as music pervades our lives, I know that there are other things that make us be happy as humans. And I wonder if you would just share a little bit about that so that we get to know you better ahead of something.
Sure. I am, if people are into astrology, some people are. I am the most typical Aquarius you'll ever read about. I'm endlessly curious about everything around me. I've always been that way. And so I always have 3 or 4 hobbies spinning around at once. And just kind of like in the winter, it's getting cool here. And immediately my mind went to, ooh, I need to buy new needles and yarn and start making scarves and hats for this season. So it's funny, I'm a very high energy, high anxiety person. So knitting is one of the few things that slows down my mind. So I got into that actually really deeply at the beginning of the quarantine. Um, so I just started to knit, and I started knitting socks, and socks take forever. Like, and I knit with really thin yarn. And something about that process of just repeating and repeating and repeating, it's very meditative for me. The things that make me tick are kind of the things that also keep me mentally healthy. So, but I'm also an open book, so I don't care to talk about. But like, I meditation is a huge piece for me. And my artistic process involves I was not built this way, but now I'm a very early riser. I'm usually up by 5 a.m. most days, sometimes 4:30 a.m. most days. Um, and now without caffeine, I'm up because I found that caffeine makes me more anxious. So
Oh
yeah, it
yeah,
sounds like superhero stuff I'm doing, but
I tell people that I'm naturally caffeinated, so I can relate.
I don't know if that's
No
real.
need for the extra thing.
I am naturally caffeinated. I only just now, after 31 years of life, have figured that out, or 30 years of life. But I I engage in a lot of different meditation and breathing practices to keep me centered. And that's where that self-study comes in. I feel like in order for me to be effective for my students to show up, and particularly when I have to deal with a lot of triggering content and deal with talking about my experience, as much as I love to share it, oftentimes um, in the context of a committee or being on diversity and equity committees or working in this work is doubly hard, you know, for someone who occupies that position of a marginalization. And so in order for me, I was trying to tell this to a student the other day, and I don't know if it registered, and maybe it won't for 5 years, but I said, part of your resistance is self-compassion.
Hmm.
I said, part of your resistance, it is okay. Like, part of what your resistance is, Bell Hooks talks about this love. There's a reason why Bell Hooks writes a book called All About Love. And she also writes books about feminism, margins to center. It's important that we preserve the heart, the seat of the self, whatever you want to call it, in the work, so that while we're tearing it down, when we build up, there's something left to build with.
Hmm.
You know, if we sacrifice all of ourselves and all of our energies and forget the joy, forget the compassion, we won't have anything left to build. We won't have any energy with which to build a new world. So we need folks who are tearing down things and building things up. We need folks who are fighting with fists and fighting with minds. We need people who are creating music, and we need people who are planting gardens. And it takes all of us doing our part and working within whatever feels like your path on this earth to make it a little bit better than what you found it as. I firmly believe that that is the key. When we're all working a little bit toward the right thing, we move much more collectively. toward greater equity, to greater freedom. See, that's the thing. The thing behind equity is actually freedom. White supremacy is enslaving white people too.
Hmm.
I'll say that in another way. White supremacy is limiting white people's ability to understand who they are, so much so that they can't be effective in who they are, that they have to tear down someone else to have an identity. White folks have lost their connection to their indigeneity, to their land, to there were native practices of white people. There are tribes of white people back in the pre-Visigothic era. There are traditions that have been lost, that were sacrificed in favor of control and power and colonization. So part of my work in doing this energy work, doing the breath work, doing these things is to connect to who I am so that I can show up as my authentic self in each day. And so that is kind of my work as a yoga teacher. That's how it ties in. It's helping folks to connect to who they really are, beyond the masks, beyond the shells, beyond the performance we put up to feel strong. Behind that is the true light of humanity. And I think that's what music brings forth. And that is why it's so powerful and such a constant in my life. Um, I have walked around your question, but I hope I answered it. Please let me know if there's
Wonderful. This is
clarification.
how this was meant to be, that we could create together a safe space in which you were willing to open up like that, and we're the better for it, and we're very, very grateful. I certainly am, not to speak for our audience, but inhabiting these dual roles of Bloomington Symphony Orchestra representative, but also as a musician and as an artist, you have been extremely inspiring, and I think it takes a lot of courage to be that vulnerable and to be that open ended like this, open to everybody, and so we really appreciate it. I want to shift here to give our audience a chance to ask you some questions. There's already been a very important one that came in from one of our members, who is also a wonderful composer in her own right. This is what she does, and we're lucky that we get to have her playing in the orchestra right now. She's Lauren Bernovsky, and I'll just read her question to you, and you can see where you go. She says, Lauren says, you have given me so much to think about, Marquise. Thank you. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about how diverse programming is packaged. What do you think about, say, a concert of exclusively works by Black composers, as opposed to one work by a Black composer on a concert of works by all composers?
Mm.
That's an interesting question because it speaks to the very one we're doing on Sunday, and I'll reserve my comment until you have a chance to respond.
Oh, that is so great. And so good to see you again, Lauren. Love Lauren. Done some of her operas and work with her. So it's great to see her. I think that this is not against Lauren. I think it's the wrong question, though. I think the question is, what are you trying to communicate on any given recital? I think any recital or performance you give is an experience, and it's meant to communicate something. That's the beauty of recitals. I've never once given a recital that was all Black composers that didn't have a theme, that didn't tell a story. I have had many recitals. Most of my recitals have included works by Black composers, and there's been some sort of narrative theme or something I'm trying to communicate. The reason I say that is both of those options aren't actually engaging deeply with the repertory at hand. And I think these works deserve the same level of rigor. If we talked about Symphonie Fantastique, which I did in class today, and all the layers of, I teach music history. So
Yeah.
of course, students love it's Halloween time, it's Symphonie Fantastique, and we're talking about, opium. It's fun. They
Yeah,
love
exactly.
it.
I was
But
gonna say you get to talk about opium and crazy people, and yeah.
right, and then Monday we talked about Clara Schumann, and I was like, "Isn't this great?" And I was like, "No, it's great." And so I'm
Yeah.
trying, but the level at which that whole piece is programmatic, it's telling a story. There is a way in which, if you wanted to tell a story, wade in the water, and now you've brought in the spiritual topic, and now you've brought in someone to talk about what water represents, and now you brought in the coded language of wade in the water as escape to freedom. That's going to bring in so many intertextual connections that once again remind us of a little bit of our universality as it magnifies a unique experience. And so my thought is, I think neither of those is really the way to go. What I prefer to see is that the composers are just part of the conversation, and that we, anytime we program, after we've determined what we want to communicate, we look at that program and say, is this all white men? Are these all dead composers? Is there a wide variety of viewpoints? Because what you want is when someone comes to a concert is the diversity of your audience is reflected in your repertory, so that as they watch the concert, they can see pieces of their identity played out on stage. And they go home and say, this concert changed me today. And therefore, the arts is powerful, and therefore we're going to keep paying for it, and therefore we're going to keep seeing it in our communities, because this is life-giving activity.
Absolutely.
It's more than, so yeah, so I hope that answers the question. Although, if I had to ask, I prefer, if it was a choice between those two, I'd probably prefer a concert of all Black composers, because there's been far too many concerts where it's all white composers. So maybe that's the way to start tipping the scale, but I'm an idealist, and what I'd like to get to is where we see all of this repertory, and that when we find, there's so many resources out there, if you have a particular concept you're trying to get across, use those resources and see, are there composers of color? Are there queer composers? Are there composers who are otherwise marginalized? That maybe I could tell their story as part of this grand story, grand narrative. So I hope that helps.
No, that's great. I would love to just make a small comment about that, that in the particular case of BSO and this particular concert, there were other factors, other perhaps admittedly practical factors that went into choosing the one featured work by Florence Price. And many of them just had to do with the fact that the orchestra had not come together since the beginning of the pandemic. Sunday is going to be the first time we are together as an orchestra at the BCT, at our venue, Buskers Chumley Theater, since February 2020. And I was simply just worried about tackling a completely different piece for which there's no frame of reference, for myself included, without having really the chance to just delve deeper into that. And also really being careful of, when you talk about the program of all Black composers, let's say, you see that a lot, you guessed it, in February, and that's it, or at least not as often. And it's during February, Black History Month, we're gonna put all those concerts on, and we wanted to make sure that it didn't happen that way. And anyway, it's just an interesting thing, all these challenges of programming that are so multifaceted.
Yeah.
And,
well, let me say something. I have had festivals. I mean, we have the Price Fest, and I've had the Celebration of African American Music. I piloted that at Georgia Southern University. I've had themed concerts that are about putting forth marginalized composers. So I think there's a place for that. But we have to question ourselves when it becomes we only do it in February. That's the real problem. It's when, okay, I've checked off my box, and that's where that self-study comes in. It's like, why is that enough for us?
Well, right now, I mean, we're celebrating. We're just at the tail end. We just finished National Hispanic Heritage Month, September 15th to October 15th, and it's sometimes similar. Or you have. I'm just gonna go there because I think it's important. You have your Cinco de Mayo concerts in May, when Cinco de Mayo is not even a holiday that is that widely celebrated or recognized, and so it's very, very easy to fall into those places of checking boxes. And I really hope that we'll just continue to work against doing that kind of thing. I believe that there is a hand raised, and I think we should just let them share with a little bit. Sorry, I'm just pulling my gallery up just to make sure I'm not missing it. Kira, help me out if I maybe missed it.
I believe it's Kennedy.
I think Kennedy. There we go. Kennedy, do you want to just go ahead and jump in?
Sorry.
I'll just briefly introduce you, since you're there with a Q puppy. Kennedy is one of our flutists in the orchestra, but she's also a wonderful musicologist, and she's helping us a lot to put this concert together. So thank you, Kennedy, for being here, and go ahead, ask your question.
Hi, Kennedy.
Yeah. Hi, Marquese, or Dr. Carter. So yeah, thank you for sharing your background. I find it really interesting that our backgrounds kind of overlap in certain ways but we this, like we have similar questions that we wanted to ask, but we entered through different disciplines. And so, yeah, I'm in ethnomusicology here for those that don't know. You mentioned Dr. Jones, she's my dissertation chair, so we share that lineage too. But ethnomusicology here is famously not in the music school, but I probably will end up working in a music school, working on Black music research. I was just curious, as someone who's about to be done, selfishly, what has it been like doing Black music research in a music school? Have you faced any challenges, or has it any, okay. But anyway, if you could just speak to that, that would be lovely.
Oh gosh, Kenny, that's a whole nother discussion. So there's a couple levels to that question. I mean, there's just the general shock of leaving the intensity of a doctoral program and then moving into academic life. They're just things that you can't be prepared for. And I think the biggest thing is learning what your boundaries are around particularly racial justice work in the academy. Because you have to think your first year, or first 2 or 3 years, you're just getting used to the institution. You've got lots of new course preps. So you've got lots of copies to make, lots of just sweat equity, getting your online modules, getting your grade book. There's just so much to work on that oftentimes they hire you because of your unique perspective. And then they want you to be on every committee. Right now I'm on a lot. So I've had to actually say I'm on faculty senate, and it's my first year. And I'm on a presidential diversity, equity, inclusion committee. And I had to have a talk with my boss, and I said, I can't do more than that. So okay, I just had to have a good talk and say, that's about all I could do in terms of service if you want me to be effective in the classroom. And luckily, she's very understanding. And that's really the key, is like learning to define those boundaries. The other change is just, it's probably different ethnomusicology, but I think the finding time for the scholarship, depending on what kind of school you're at, if you're at this is kind of a comprehensive regional school, so lots of teaching emphasis. But if you're at a research one or institution that wants you to do research all the time and have a certain one or two articles a year, they're going to make room for you to do that. But if you're someone like me who has a lot of interests, it's sometimes hard to find time to perform and lecture and write. That's probably the most poignant thing, because there's not space given for that. It's just assumed that you'll work all day and then somehow you'll find time to do research and perform and make up all your lessons. So it's a lot of just learning how to define boundaries, and learn how you can get your research and creative activity in sort of a measurable through line over 4 or 5 years, so that even if you have lots of diverse interests like me, you got to pick 1 or 2 things that kind of fit in a trajectory and have like a 4 or 5 year plan, and that not leading to a dissertation, just leading to hopefully tenure. So it's there's just a lot of different things that change. And depending on what kind of school you're at, it really just depends on what they emphasize at that school and how much support you have. Those are really big things to be thinking about. But yeah, definitely it's important that we have voices like yours in the academy and ethnomusicological voices. And it's very vital that we have them in integrated music departments, because the types of conversations we have in my music history class, I wouldn't be so presumptuous to say they've never happened, but I don't think they've happened with this frequency where we talk about we have talked about everything from rape culture to gender and racism in Mozart operas to today we talked about hallucinogenic drug use and how it showed up in music making. And these are just like these are poignant topics that students need to be thinking about. Maybe not so much a hallucinogenic drug, that was just for fun, but the other ones are really important, poignant topics that students are going to have to face. In world music class, which I teach, which I have no ethnomusicological training, but I taught a world music seminar, and we talked about cultural appropriation and programming and canonization, what gets to be in the canon. These are the type of things that this generation are going to have to be facing in their classrooms, in their performance, and just in their everyday life. And so partly what we're doing is helping prepare them to work toward the future that they want to see. and to really ask the hard questions. That's what I see my role as. And I think that's why it's so important to have those worlds colliding.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kennedy, for asking that question, and thank you so much for your answer. Also, I'm wondering if there are other questions. So here's another one. Well, here's a tricky one. I mean, and you've talked about this a little bit, but Patricia asks, what can arts organizations do to further the Black composers, so further Black composers? And maybe you can just give us a very specific answer, a call to action, if you will. But that's one question.
Buy scores directly from the composer.
Mm-hmm.
There's one. American Composers Alliance is a great place to buy scores. Support when these performances happen, help get the word out. If you're in a community other than Bloomington, which is actually kind of a lovely place in a lot of ways, but if you're end up in a smaller community and you have a small community orchestra, ask the director, hey, I wonder how many people would like to hear more Florence Price, more ... more this and that. So really, like, we live in a capitalist society, so consider ways in which you can leverage your dollars to support initiatives that are working toward equity and change. I think that's a big one, and I hate to be the one that asks for money, but that's how things work in America. So, using your dollars to support movements that you like, writing to the cultural arts organizations of your city and saying, I would love to see, and maybe even doing a petition, I'd love to see a dedicated arts corridor for Latinx and Black and non-white art. I would love to see a corridor for that. I would love to see cultural festivals that allow folks to tell their stories. Those types of initiatives are all available. You can also, support your organizations that do that. Support Price Fest. We're working very diligently. We're actually working on the Price Pledge initiative this year, which is taking a little longer to roll out than I would like, but we're rolling out this Price Pledge initiative where we're going to send educational ambassadors to partner institutions, studios, university departments, arts organizations who have an educational arm. We're going to send educational ambassadors to work with their students, introduce them to the works of Price and other Black composers, starting with piano music, providing educational resources, and creating a sense of accountability so that we can really start to see measurable change in the programming procedures that we see in the conservatories and studios. So that after 4 years of partnership, we can see, oh, you've gone from programming 85% European composers to maybe a more equitable 50-50%. That's actually what we're looking for. And believe it or not, I don't think that's very unreasonable to say 50-50. I don't think that's unreasonable at all. But if you look at the Institute for Composer Diversity, it's a wonderful website, and they collect programming data. I think it was Beethoven was the most programmed composer in 2019. Beethoven still was. And then again,
the anniversary that made that go up, but yeah.
Right. And then we had that. And then Mozart still is a close second. We don't even get Price is like 0.2% of orchestras, I think it was 2% of orchestras. And Price was having a big awakening. So there's a lot of work to be done in saying, I'm not going to support that. I'm not going to continue to support this type of programming. And that'll really wake up these organizations like the Met, who just I got to see Fire Shut Up in My Bones. If you have a chance to see that in Met HD, it's a great show. It's a great start. There's so much further to go because the Met has been saying for years, those shows aren't marketable. Well, I've gone to those shows. I went to the show, it was packed. It's marketable. But somewhere along the line, the folks who they think are their central demographic need to say, I'm not going to this anymore because I don't want to hear the same stuff over and over again. It's great to hear some Verdi. I love my Aida. I love my Puccini every once in a while. But some of these pieces, I'm not sure what else they have to tell us. I think there's so much that hasn't been written that if we raise our voices and leverage our dollars, we can start to see a different concert environment. Because the American Concert Hall should not look just like the Berlin Philharmonic. It really shouldn't. Okay, so this is my thought. I'll wrap that up.
Wonderful. I think that's a great way to, in fact, wrap up our session. I want to be mindful of everyone's time. We said we would stop at 8, so right about now. I want to just take the opportunity to thank you once more. You know, I can't wait to see you in the flesh, besides our so far two-dimensional meetings. And I can't wait for the audience to hear what you have to say via your singing voice and your spoken voice. And it's just been so great. I think it's food for thought for everything we need to do. And I'll just sort of put a little pin on it, a little cherry on the pie, so to speak, by saying that, you know, as we continue to have these important conversations, that we highlight the art itself, and that we are not just motivated by statistics. So, you know, when you talk about the 50-50, that's still born out of the quality of the art itself, first and foremost. And then you see how it can coincide with those statistics, so that, you know, we don't fall into pitfalls. But
yes, non-critical thinking.
exactly. So thank you again so much. I'm enlightened. I'm stronger than I was an hour ago. So we really appreciate your candor and your openness, and I know that it'll just be such a treat for everybody to get to see you and hear you on Sunday, and to see our fellow BSO music makers with this great symphony and this great important voice. So thank you so much. Thank you everybody for being here tonight, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you all. Look forward to seeing you.
Thanks so much. Bye bye.